And Daniel, I think we can, give it a minute or so for the system to catch up as people start to log in. Hi, folks who have just called in. We're just giving people another minute or two to call in, and then Daniel will get us started.
We have one question, Ezra, about whether this recording will be shared. I think so, right?
Yes. So I just responded that we'll be recording the sessions for the next couple of days, and we will get them up on the YouTube, Division 34 YouTube channel in the next couple of days.
Great.
Okay, well, Daniel, I think we already have more people in attendance than we usually do in the room at APA meetings. So I think you can go ahead and right.
All right. Well, welcome to our first virtual live event of this APA 2020 virtual convention. I'm appreciative for all of you joining us. I see that there are, as Ezra said, a number of people already here, and others will be joining as we get going. I just want to briefly state that you are joining the awards session, the awards recognition session for Division 34 of the American Psychological Association. If you aren't familiar with Division 34, Division 34 is the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology. And it's a great place to be. It's a great place to be a member. And so if you aren't already familiar with us, or if you haven't contemplated, joining, now's a great time to do so. And if you have questions about that, you can talk to me or talk to Ezra. And also you can see the information that I have behind my head. So I just want to go ahead and launch in and make this is about our award winners and their accomplishments. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then we have Adam Pearson here, who's going to answer a few questions. I have a brief interview that we'll have with him, and then we'll open it up to any questions that audience members may have for him. So we have 5 awards at Division 34. And I'll just go ahead and tell you what those are, and then we can talk about who the winners were for 2020. So the first award is called the Newman Prashansky Career Achievement Award. And the winner this year, the 2020 winner, is Dr. Joseph Reeser at Griffith University, based in Queensland, Gold Coast campus, Queensland, Australia, where it is currently 3 a.m. So he's not on this call with us, but I have a statement that I'll read from him in a moment. Our Early Career Achievement Award is awarded this year to Dr. Adam Pearson, who's Associate Professor of Psychological Science at Pomona College, and he is here, despite it being early for him. It's morning, out on the West Coast, and we'll be talking to him in just a moment. Our Carol Saunders Travelship Award this year went to Sylvia Collado, who's at the University of Zaragoza. She's on the Sociology and Psychology faculty there, and she's based in Spain. Our Graduate Student Research Award went to Nate Shipley, and I think maybe he's one of our participants today. I'm not sure. I thought I saw his name. And then our Undergraduate Student Research winner is Logan Bickle. So I just want to thank our awards committee and our committee chair, Sonia Sochdeva, for looking through all these applications and for doing all the hard work of vetting our applicants. We have wonderful and talented winners this year, as is typically the case, but I think especially this year we can be proud of these award winners. So I'll go ahead and jump right into the statement that I wanted to read. Dr. Reiser had asked me to read this to you all since he wasn't going to be here. So I'll go ahead with that before we get to our conversation with Dr. Pearson. So he says, I can offer a few comments about what I've been principally involved in over the past decade and more recently, which is essentially that of offering an environmental psychological perspective on the human dimensions of climate change to largely multidisciplinary audiences. I was one of the amazingly few psychologists involved in the last major IPCC report and the last EPA US Global Change Research Program report. I've held adjunct professorial roles in the past decade at Griffith University in applied psychology and the University of Queensland in architecture, but where my personal research and writing focus has been on the issue of climate change. Following from my involvement with the APA Task Force on Climate Change, and a few colleagues here obtained funding to seriously examine public risk perceptions and understandings of climate change in Australia, initially along with research partners at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. I spent several years at Durham University in the UK as a reader in environmental psychology and caught up with a number of social psychology and environmental psychology colleagues there. In any case, we undertook two very major online national surveys in Australia over 2010 and 2011, arguably the most comprehensive surveys undertaken to date, including multi-item psychometric scales of carefully specified constructs, along with some open-ended items, with the objective of clearly examining and documenting a spectrum of considerations relating to the human dimensions of climate change from a psychological perspective. The resulting database, analyses, publications, and presentations have taken up much of my academic life since then, though I have much broader interests across psychology, the social sciences, and the humanities. Perhaps the best window on what I've been doing is found in a just published article in Wire's Climate Change, for which I and my co-author were asked to draft a brief piece for a broader science and public audience in Advanced Science News. I see this Wire's article as reflecting what has been a career melding of the humanities and psychology, as I have a BSc in English, but a master's and PhD in psychology from the Loyola University in Chicago. And I have a professional background spanning applied, social, cross-cultural, and environmental psychology, mediated in part by a postdoctoral fellowship at Arnhem Land in Northern Australia from 1974 through 1977, documenting vernacular architecture, contemporary housing issues, the psychosocial impacts of uranium mining, and the then just initiated Arnhem Highway on remote Aboriginal communities, and documenting and collecting Aboriginal art and material culture for the Australian National Museum and Art Gallery. This followed a 2-year initial academic appointment at the University of Winnipeg in 1972, where I was offered one of the first environmental psychology courses in Canada, undertook research on crowding in public venues, housing issues for First Nation communities in Winnipeg, and public risk perceptions and responses to natural disasters in Canada. The Wire's article both addresses and captures the current challenges for psychology in communicating what an informed and crucial psychological perspective is with respect to the human dimensions of climate change, and where, why, and how an environmental psychology perspective can particularly well capture the interesting dimensions and considerations relating to how an individual encounters, perceives, makes sense of, and comes to terms with what global climate change is and implies for our planet, the biosphere, humanity, one's community, oneself, and psychological adaptation and issue engagement. I am honored to be the recipient of the 2020 Newman Prashansky Career Achievement Award. Thank you very much. He also sent me the article that he spoke of, the Wire's climate change article, which we will share out to this group. So with that, I want to get to our guest here, who's here with us, Adam Pearson, who again, if you're just joining, is our Early Career Achievement Award winner for 2020. And Adam is an associate professor of psychological science and a member of the graduate faculty in the School of Social Science, Policy and Evaluation at Claremont Graduate University. His research explores how group processes impact environmental decision-making and collective action. Work in Dr. Pearson's lab seeks to understand factors that make intergroup cooperation challenging for majority and minority groups, and the implications of these dynamics for addressing local and global sustainability challenges. Some current projects are exploring how race, ethnicity, and social class influence political polarization around the issue of climate change, the impact of stereotypes and perceived norms on environmental decision-making, public understanding of environmental inequities, and factors shaping public engagement with environmental organizations. At Pomona, Professor Pearson teaches social psychology, research design and methodology, and climate of change, a cross-disciplinary seminar on climate change and human behavior, co-taught with Professor Leela Hawkins, a climate scientist at Harvey Mudd College. So with that, I welcome Dr. Pearson and congratulate him on winning this award this year. It's richly deserved. So welcome, Dr. Pearson.
Thanks so much.
And we have a few questions, or I have a few questions that I'd like to ask Dr. Pearson. And we also can, of course, answer any questions that come up in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, or any questions that come from the audience that you want to speak to. You can also do that. So feel free to do that. So Adam, can you tell us about one or two current projects that speak to the impact of stereotypes and perceived norms on environmental decision-making?
Yeah, and can you hear me okay?
I can.
Right.
Can others? Yeah, I think so. I think we're...
So first, I just want to say, yeah, thanks for that really nice introduction, Daniel, and thanks Ezra and also the awards committee. I know how much work these things are, having been on the other side for SPSP awards in the past. And I also want to give a quick shout out to my collaborators, several of my close collaborators, John Schold, Neil Lewis, and Rainer Romero Cañas, and my former graduate student, Matt Bluhm, too, who deserve a lot of credit, have been really pivotal in advancing much of the work that you just mentioned. So as you mentioned, I'm interested in understanding how group processes, intergroup dynamics, so things like prejudice and stereotyping, discrimination, and inequality shape how people think about environmental problems, and what the implications are of those processes for coalition building, especially in increasingly diverse societies like the US. And of course, we know policymaking occurs on behalf of other people. So group processes are really central. They're critical to understanding why problems like climate change are so complicated and often feel so intractable. Thinking about sort of some of the work that we've done, looking at over a decade of public opinion data, we found, for example, that Blacks and Latinos are less politically polarized when it comes to climate change, and are more likely to view climate change as an immediate danger, as a personal threat. And this includes moderate and conservative leaning minorities. And so we're now looking to see if these and other minority groups are less susceptible to partisan messaging. But at the same time, we've found that the US public is substantially misperceiving and substantially underestimates the environmental concerns of some of the most vulnerable groups, minorities and lower income Americans, and misperceive them as not caring about the environment or problems like climate change. In fact, these are groups that are among the most concerned about those problems in those same polls. They also stereotype environmentalists as white and middle class. And even more surprising to us, we found that the same pattern I just described holds up if you look across pretty much every demographic group or interest group that we surveyed, including minority and lower income Americans. So this is a classic sort of pattern of pluralistic ignorance. And it's, in our opinion, a big problem for coalition building. We know, of course, from a long history of social psychological work on social norms that people may not act on even very deeply held values if they think others, and particularly people like them, don't share those views. So these kinds of beliefs, stereotypes about who's concerned about the environment may suppress engagement, and particularly among the most impacted and vulnerable communities. So now we're exploring what might be fueling these beliefs and some of their implications.
Great, thank you so much. So you've written and you spoke a little bit about some of the work that you're undergoing currently, but you've also written in the past about the lack of diversity among climate researchers and how this could be partly responsible for at least the perception or maybe the reality of a lack of climate activism among diverse stakeholders. So could you elaborate on that a bit and share what you think we can do about it as a community?
Yeah, another sort of set of disparities that we've looked at are disparities, as you mentioned, in the environmental movement, occupational disparities, and disparities in NGO representation. And a few years ago, my collaborator, John Schuld at Cornell, and I were looking at census data on occupational disparities in science and engineering fields broadly within the United States. And one thing that really struck us was the huge amount of variability in representation among minority groups across the science and engineering fields. And we quickly saw that some of the worst offenders were among the environmental science and engineering fields, broadly defined. So up to 4 times the level of disparities, racial and ethnic disparities, relative to other science and engineering disciplines. And we know from, of course, the work of a lot of other people, Dorcetta Taylor at University of Michigan, Cameron Brick at Amsterdam, also have found similar racial and ethnic disparities among academics. So, for example, Cameron's work is, they looked at representation in the world's largest Earth and Environmental and Atmospheric Science Conference, the American Geophysical Union. These are people deciding what to study and how to study it and whom to study. And they found similar disparities, substantial racial and ethnic disparities in the representation at the AGU. So we think this is a critical problem in terms of thinking about, who are the gatekeepers and who are coming up with the solutions and identifying the problems that we're studying, and also an issue for coalition building, as I mentioned before, in a very diverse and increasingly diverse society like the US.
Thank you. So what do you think psychologists could be doing better in the way of research methodologies, communication strategies, applied practice, pedagogy, to help boost public understanding of environmental inequities and increase pro-environmental decision-making?
So that's a $1 million question in my mind, especially the question of how do you boost public understanding of environmental inequities. I think environmental inequities are really complicated, and I know there's an explosion of interest in climate and environmental justice today within the United States and globally, and particularly in domestic policymaking. So it's now become a major pillar of the 2020 Democratic Party and their platform. But my collaborators, John Schuld and Neil Lewis, and I have found huge deficits in public understanding. So there was a recent NORC 2019 survey showing, for example, that only about 1/3 of young adults, so this is Americans aged 18 to 35, typically the most engaged on an issue like climate change, only about 1/3 believe that climate change will disproportionately affect people of color and the poor. And so that represents both a challenge in our minds and also an opportunity for shaping public understanding in ways that might be really critical. So, we know from psychology that simply conveying facts, throwing facts at people, of course, often doesn't work. And when you simply convey facts about disparities, that may not only be ineffective in the environmental realm, but potentially harmful. For example, Courtney Bonham, who's at UC Santa Cruz, has done really cool work showing that there are physical space stereotypes, that physical spaces in neighborhoods that Blacks live in the United States are typically stereotyped as industrial or blighted, and that those stereotypes can lead people to be more okay with citing a new toxic industrial facility in a majority Black neighborhood. So they have important implications. And informing people of existing environmental inequities may simply exacerbate those stereotypes. And also other problematic ways of thinking, narratives of victimhood, and potentially fatalistic views among people who may feel impacted and feel like they don't have any way to affect change. So this is something we're really interested in my lab, but we need a lot more empirical work, I think, as a field to really tease apart what are effective modes of communication to communicate environmental justice and injustice to the public, and to better understand the factors that impact really who gets a seat at the proverbial decision-making table. The Biden campaign and other political messengers and policymakers and public-facing environmental organizations, I think, would do well to hire psychologists and people trained in our methodologies to better understand how inequities can be effectively communicated, and also to understand where the key gaps in knowledge are.
Yeah, it seems really critical to get it right because there's so many pitfalls as you outlined. So looking forward to what you're going to do next, and what others are doing to advance our knowledge in that space. So great. So I've got one last question before we turn it over to audience questions, and that is, what advice would you give to graduate students or maybe newly minted PhDs who find your career path inspiring? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, I love that question. It's, I came from a prejudice and intergroup relations background in terms of my training. I worked with Jack DeVideo, and never thought I'd be studying environmental problems. I've always been interested in sustainability issues, but it really was not till I began working with a friend and now close collaborator of mine who I've mentioned, John Schuld at Cornell. He's a fellow social psychologist. He had been doing really cool work on climate change. And we wanted to work together. We wanted to work together thinking about the social dimensions of climate change. And I quickly realized just how deeply relevant the study of intergroup relations is to the study of climate change. We have intergroup relations researchers who have been doing really seminal work on environmental problems and climate change, like Janet Swim in our field. But there are I would say, a much larger percentage of folks in that discipline, that particular niche in the field, who haven't traditionally studied sustainability problems. So the first thing I would say is to younger folks is that we should really try to mine our discipline broadly and bring in folks with backgrounds that we might not traditionally consider in the wheelhouse of conservation and sustainability. Really, any and all perspectives I think we're realizing today are relevant. And I can think of, there really are great young scholars who are doing really cool integrative work. Just off the top of my mind, I can think of, Amanda Carrico, who's a past early career winner here, who has looked at, for example, among other things, gender dynamics in environmental decision-making among farmers in South Asia. I can think of Caitlin Ramey, who's another social psychologist who's in a public policy school at the University of Michigan and doing great work on public policy and intersections with climate change. Lee Van Boven and Dave Sherman and their students, they come from judgment and decision-making, political psych and health psych backgrounds. They're doing really innovative work these days on climate change and climate change activism. And there are many others with hidden interest in climate change. So I think whenever I go to conferences and I talk to people, I'm always surprised how many people are deeply interested in climate change and sustainability problems, but maybe don't formally study them. I would also encourage people to chat with psychologists who are working in the NGO world. We have a lot who are represented at Division 34, but to strike up collaborations, at least conversations with them. A lot of these folks come to our meetings. So Rainer Romero Cañas is one of those psychologists. He's a social psychologist at the Environmental Defense Fund. He invited me to speak at their headquarters, I think it was probably back in 2014, on diversity, and we have since become close research collaborators, and that's been really, really great. and there are growing opportunities inside and outside of academia. Columbia just recently announced the creation of the first ever climate school, which is going to serve as an interdisciplinary hub for academics, really wide range of academics. They're also hiring. There are many environmental schools and sustainability-minded business schools that are interested in understanding human dimensions to environmental problems, including psychology and what psychologists bring to the table, I think now more than ever. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to be in this field.
That's a lot of great advice. Thank you. So I'm gonna look at the Q&A. We've got just a few minutes left, so maybe we can get to one or two questions for Adam. I've got one here. This is from Dr. Ruth Richards. And I'll just read this for you. So it says, first, for some people, climate catastrophes seem remote and change is slow, which is not the case compared to social issues on the doorstep. Yet, B, with COVID-19, we are seeing larger systems issues erupting everywhere, quickly in a nonlinear, dynamic way, chaos and complexity issues on our doorstep. We see the broader systems, strands, and interactions. For climate change, do we need a paradigm shift generally and personal perceptual shifts ourselves to look more broadly at our collective lives? Is this a more fluid time for recruiting people, for seeing interconnection, and for affecting change?
Yeah, so one of the things that's being raised there is the fact that COVID has exposed these vast social inequities in society, which have existed, right? Always existed, but they've exposed, I think, for large segments of the public, and maybe perhaps as important, or maybe perhaps more important, to decision makers who might not have been so aware before. So I think to some extent, this may really be a unique window for thinking about some of the hidden social dimensions to environmental problems and sustainability problems that I had been talking about that pertain to justice, environmental justice. And of course, we're coming off the heels of the largest protests in modern US history with the racial justice protests and Black Lives Matter movement. So racial justice and social justice issues are intersecting with health justice issues right at a time when there's global heightened awareness of climate change coming into 2020. This was after the September global climate demonstrations. So there really are intersecting issues here that it's a time like no other. And we see it again with the Democratic Party platform within the United States, in the Biden campaign, and all those who are running for the Democratic primary, coming out with major climate initiatives and climate justice as central pillars to their platform. So I think there is potentially a window here that psychologists, researchers, and practitioners can capitalize on to really think hard about how do you communicate, how do we understand first what others know and understand about the ways that an issue like climate change creates winners and losers, how it impacts different groups differently, and what can be done about that. So, and how do people understand that, and how can it be communicated to communities, frontline communities, decision makers who have major stakes in the consequences. So I think the timing here is really unique.
I agree. I think this is an unusual moment in so many ways, but it's an opportunity for all of us to elevate this issue and how it intersects with, as you mentioned, with so many other social justice issues. I think this is a great time to do that, at least. I think that is all of our time. So I don't know if you have any last words you'd like to say, but if not, I just want to congratulate you again, Adam, on this honor, on receiving this award. It is well-deserved, and thank you for being here with us today and sharing some of your thoughts with us on this occasion. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much. Appreciate it again. Thanks. And thanks again, Ezra and the committee and everybody who's chimed in here, zooming in from afar. Really appreciate that.
Yeah. And just a quick note to those who are here with us. We have programming for the rest of the day today, and we have programming again, live programming tomorrow. And again, we have one event on Saturday. So join us for as much as you can. Our next session is Sex for Good, interactive Q&A. So join us for that. That will start in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, so folks, I've put up our program. Thank you, Adam, for joining us. It was a great way to kick off today's, all the programming that we have. And so hopefully you all can see I've just shared the schedule for the rest of today. So we'll have a little break right now and we'll reconvene at 1:45 for the Sex for Good session. And then we've got sessions at 2:30 on benefits of nature exposure. And then we've got a couple of other events later today for which you need to do a separate registration because those will happen as meetings, Zoom meetings rather than as webinar because they're even more interactive. So from 3:30 to 4:30, Reuben Sussman of the ACEEE will be running the Behavioral Solutions Workshop. You can still sign up if you're interested. At 7 o'clock, the newly formed Division 34 Climate Change and Mental Health Working Group will have a kickoff social hour. And again, the registration is certainly still open. And at 9 o'clock tonight, the Division 34 Student Committee is also hosting its own virtual happy hour. Everybody is, of course, welcome at all of these events. So we will now go on pause for a few minutes and then we'll get started at right at 1:45. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us for this session, this live interactive question and answer session. I just want to quickly say that you're participating by being here in programming from Division 34 of the American Psychological Association. Division 34, if you're not familiar, is the Society for Environmental, Population, really important for this session, and Conservation Psychology. So if you don't already know about us, or if you have heard of us but haven't joined, please consider becoming more involved. We would love to have you be part of our group. So I'm just going to quickly, since our time is limited, I'm going to quickly introduce this session, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists who are here. So this session is called Sex for Good: Using Psychology to Break Taboos, Advance Human Rights, and Aid Conservation. And the session is going to highlight the campaign programming of two organizations working at the intersection of health, the environment, and social change. Both groups bring to light in an entertaining way the taboo subject of sex, the need for comprehensive sexual education, universal access to contraception, and the importance of talking about one's desired family size with their partner, family, and social circles. And joining us today, we have Kelley Dennings, who is the Population and Sustainability Campaigner for the Center for Biological Diversity, based in Washington, D.C. We have Bill Ryerson, who is the president and founder of the Population Media Center, based in South Burlington, Vermont. We have Bob Walker, who's the president of the Population Institute, based also in Washington, D.C. And not able to join us today, but also part of this panel, is Stacia Dreyer, who's a senior consultant at EMI Consulting in Seattle. So with that, I'll turn it over to the group.
Thank you, Daniel. First of all, I want to thank you for hosting this panel. This is really a critically important topic. Scientists have been warning us for decades now that population growth and our ever-increasing consumption of material goods is threatening the future of the planet. And that includes up to 1 million plant and animal species that may be in danger of extinction by the end of this century. So I'm just going to turn it over to Bill Ryerson and to Kelley to give us a short summation of their presentations that they did earlier.
Can I jump in here really quick and just say a few comments in regards to the Stacia component before we get started?
Sure.
Thank you. So in May of 2018, I was fortunate enough to be in a room of thought leaders as part of the Psychology of Sustainable Consumption Conference. And I participated in a discussion facilitated by Stacia and Tim Kurz about the food, energy, and water nexus. And as Daniel said, Stacia can't be with us today to kick off the session, but I'm gonna do my best to fill in. So the outcome of the discussion that she facilitated is a paper titled Towards the Psychology of the Food, Energy, Water Nexus, Opportunities, Costs, and Opportunities. And I remember the facilitators providing the group with definitions of the few nexus and highlighting, the lack of peer-reviewed research articles about the nexus. And the conversation between participants talked about the many barriers in working across topics. And for a complete list of the barriers, you can check out the paper, which I'll put in the chat function. But one of the barriers was specific to this conversation. So psychology researchers may avoid the nexus because of the potential solutions to resolve issues within the nexus are controversial or polarizing. So things like needing to reduce worldwide human population size or density, as well as needing to change types and scales of consumption systems. The number of people on the planet and how and where they live impacts the few nexus, and population is a deeply sensitive topic. So an outcome of the discussion of the paper was a call to extend the framing of the nexus to food, energy, times, human, to talk about this component of the population. So it recognizes how human actions in the form of both consumption and population impact the few nexus. So that was kind of where Stacia's angle would have come from if she was able to join us today, and hopefully it set the stage for the discussion. But now I'll turn it over to Bill to give a short summary of his presentation that you can go find the full presentation of at the main APA conference site.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. I know it sometimes takes some strong coffee to attend an online conference, so my hat's off to you for participating in this. My talk focused on the psychology of behavior change, and I mentioned the work of Miguel Sabido, a telenovela producer at the largest network in Mexico, Televisa, and his use of Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura's social learning theory and social cognitive theory for creating storylines in which key characters sort out conflicting advice from positive and negative characters. And these characters, who are designed to represent segments of the audience, gradually evolve into role models for the audience. And they demonstrate how to overcome the societal obstacles to change and the benefits of the new behavior, and also how to deal with pushback that comes from adopting new behaviors. So Bandura's social learning theory, of course, deals with how role models influence observers and what makes a role model more or less influential. And his social cognitive theory deals with how someone gains self-efficacy, i.e. the belief that they have the right and the ability to accomplish some new task. And these theories, along with the work of Paul MacLean, a brain scientist who studied different functions in the different parts of the human brain, are part of the methodology created by Miguel Sabido. MacLean found in his research that while we are cognitive, supposedly rational beings, most of our behavioral decisions are made in the parts of the brain that deal primarily with emotion. So appealing to people emotionally, and particularly the emotions associated with role models, is a very effective way to bring about change. And I gave some illustrations of the changes we've been able to bring about in 22 years of Population Media Center's work, which has spanned now 51 countries and reached 500 million people with primetime and daytime serialized dramas, either radio or TV, including work in some countries where half of family planning adopters or more have, when asked why they came to the clinic, have named our program by name. This is true in Sierra Leone, true in northern Nigeria, 40% naming our program in Rwanda. So we've had huge audiences and huge measurable behavior change in many of the countries where we've used this strategy for promoting reproductive health, gender equality, and environmental protection behaviors by the audience.
Great.
Kelley, back to you.
Kelley.
All right, and thank you all. So I did put a link to the paper in the chat, and I also put a link to Population Media Center. So if you want to check out any, as we're chatting, you can check out Bill's work there. So the 2-minute synopsis of the presentation that you'll see if you go to the main APA site for the Center for Biological Diversity is, in the fall of 2019, we conducted a national representative survey to analyze the awareness, the attitudes, behavioral intention, and norms around population consumption and wildlife. So when we talk about population, we take a human rights lens. It's done with justice and equity in mind. So I like to kind of start out with that. And, the center denounces any type of population control, coercion, ecofascism, genocide, eugenics, or closing of borders. So hopefully that helps set the stage for the rest of our talk also. So we surveyed 899 people across the United States for a 95% confidence interval. If you'd like further information about the statistical validity of the survey, please email me, and I can put my email in the chat. So some of the narratives say that population growth is mainly responsible for the rapid loss of species biodiversity, while others say it's consumption. The center really focuses on both topics, especially since we're based here in the United States and focus our work in the United States. So we were interested in knowing what the general public thought. And from our survey, 60% see the issue as being both also. And as noted by other previous research, our survey showed that 80% agree that all types of birth control should be legal, free, and easily accessible. However, as we work on these solutions, it's important to keep in mind that reproductive health care, as we talked about on the session earlier where the award winners were talking, reproductive health care is riddled with inequalities. So others in our survey seem to understand that too. 2/3 of respondents somewhat or strongly agree that immigrants, people of color, and other marginalized communities disproportionately lack access to healthcare. So through our research, we found that around 70% of survey respondents somewhat or strongly agree that the world's population is growing too fast and it is driving other animals to extinction. And the same number, 70%, believe that stabilizing population growth would protect the environment. And if all of this is true, they feel we have a moral responsibility to act. So I leave you with this question. What do you think? Do we have a moral responsibility to advocate for family planning and increase education as solutions to environmental degradation if extinctions are unavoidable without slowing population growth? And if you say yes, please reach out to me or reach out to Bill. I'm sure either one of us would be interested in partnering with folks, academics and researchers interested in doing this work. So I will put a copy of my slides that you can download in the chat along with my email.
Thank you.
And I think we'll take some questions from Bob now.
Sure, thank you very much for your presentation, Kelley. I'm going to turn back to Bill first for a couple of questions before we turn this over to our audience. Bill, where's your organization done the most work? You mentioned a couple of the countries where you've had successful programs, but give us a better idea of sort of the scale and scope of the Population Media Center's work.
Most of our programs have been in countries where the status of women and girls is particularly low and where fertility rates and unwanted fertility rates are especially high. There's a huge unmet need for contraception among people who are not using modern methods of contraception and don't want additional children now or in the immediate future. The barriers to the use of contraception as determined by demographic and health surveys in developing countries all over the world, about 95 of them have had regular demographic and health surveys, find that the primary barriers to use of contraception are people have heard it's dangerous, misinformation about its effects, misinformation about whether it's even effective, and various forms of opposition, religious opposition, spousal opposition in particular. And so dealing with those barriers is critically important, and it's not something one can do with short-term public service announcements. These are countries in some cases where fathers think it's fine to marry their daughters at age 15 and rather than sending them to school. And so changing somebody's attitudes in a place like rural Ethiopia requires a long-term intervention where the audience falls in love over time with key characters who evolve into role models for the audience and take them on a transition. So I mentioned Ethiopia, where we've been the longest, but we've also worked in many African countries, as well as Nepal, India, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and all of Latin America. We also have done one Hollywood show dealing with teen pregnancy in the US. That show, called East Los High, became the longest running program in the network Hulu's history. It ran for 5 years and among viewers was in the top 5 for all 5 years.
Thank you very much, Bill. Let me turn to Kelley for a second. Kelley, a lot of your work, your organization's work is North America. I really have 2 questions for you. One, can you tell us a little more about that? Because a lot of people, when they hear about the extinction of animals, focus a lot on Africa and Asia, but it's also a concern here. And secondly, I'm really interested to learn more about your endangered species condom program, which I know you've done a lot with here in North America. So tell us a little more about those 2 things.
Sure. Just be clear, I am not a biologist, but I think my coworker who is on the phone. So but I'll give us a little bit of a primer on threatened and endangered species in the United States. So we have 1,700 threatened and endangered species. This is mostly caused by agriculture, grazing, fossil fuel development, logging, urban sprawl, climate change, invasive species, and pollution. So species that were abundant in North America 2 centuries ago, like the woodland bison of West Virginia and Arizona's, Merriam's elk to the Rocky Mountain grasshopper, passenger pigeon, have all been wiped out by growing human numbers. There was a research done in 2013 in the New England area that showed between 2000 and 2050, 5 forest-dependent bird species would decrease by 38% by the year 2050 due to sprawl and housing development. So this is the work that we do. This is what we're trying to protect and prevent against, are these extinctions. And so you did mention our endangered species condoms program. So I was remiss to make a PowerPoint slide as Bill recommended, and then also didn't bring a condom box with me, but I just put in the chat bar our URL if you want to jump on and see what our endangered species condoms look like. So this is a way that we work to destigmatize the topic with a little bit of humor, but also to start these conversations, right? And this is a difficult conversation to have, talk about sex and family planning. So one of the things that we try to do with them is to start these conversations. And in this survey that I mentioned, we actually surveyed people about had they talked to their partner about the number of children they wanted, and will they be talking? There was a number of different check boxes there. And so according to our survey, at any one time, 1/5 of people in the United States are talking about the number of children they want or are planning to talk about the number of children. So currently in this process. So we really do want to provide useful conversation starters to help facilitate this. So they are great little packages that have funny little sayings on them. If you open them up inside, you'll see information about the species that is shown on the front, which are North American threatened or endangered species. And then it talks about our stance on reproductive rights. And then we have a little set of volunteers, a large set of volunteers that distribute these to zoos, museums, aquariums, college campuses, Earth Day events, adult themed kind of bears and brews types things that you might see. And so that's how we try to get them out into the world.
That's a great story, Kelley. I hope that more people will go to your website and learn more about the program. I think it's very exciting. Bill, let me.
And they're free. I forgot to mention that. You can request them for free.
Oh, there you go. That's critically important. Bill, let me turn back to you for a second. The Population Media Center puts a lot of importance on measuring the success of your serial dramas, which are typically about 2 years in length. So tell me a little more about how you actually measure your success.
Thanks, Bob. We do 2 types of quantitative surveys plus qualitative research as well. So the first of those is quantitative nationwide or language-wide, if it's a particular language within a country, surveys of maybe 3,000 people, random sample, hour-long face-to-face interviews, baseline just before we go on the air, and post-broadcast, which is normally 150 to 200 episodes later after 1.5 to 2 years. And those surveys reveal knowledge, attitudes, and self-reported behaviors, and we can then control for other variables like income, education, place of residence to see if the change among listeners is still significant compared to changes among non-listeners. So for example, on the issue of child marriage, our listeners in a program in Senegal, after controlling for other variables, were 6.3 times as likely as non-listeners to believe that a woman should be at least 19 years old to be married. So that data is perhaps the strongest evidence of change brought about by the programs, but we also do actual measurement of behavior change where there are clinic services promoted in a program. So as I mentioned, in Sierra Leone, we surveyed 1,500 new reproductive health clients. They were asked an open-ended question at clinics across the country during our program there of what motivated their visit to the clinic. And 50% of them named our program. In northern Nigeria, 67% of new clients named our program as the primary factor that had brought them to the clinic. So those are the quantitative measures. And then we also do qualitative research that includes both focus group discussions, in-depth interviews, and feedback using photography or art by listeners to understand how a program has influenced their thinking.
Thank you, Bill. That's very, very helpful. And it's a great success story. I'm glad you were able to share it with us. Daniel, do we have any questions as yet from the audience?
We do. We have one question, which I can just read to you all. So this is from Carla Bluhm, and she asks, I feel like there are some really important branches of thought here, such as gender, culture, loss of land for the natural world, and so forth, that are fascinating. I wonder if you can speak to research I have read that suggests that all countries will lose a very large amount of population over the next 100 years, with only India and Africa gaining in numbers. Is this true, and does it bring any hope for the future?
Bill, you want to take that? You
Sure,
more
I'm
on
happy
the international.
I'm happy to. This issue is one that is subject to a lot of debate, and it's been politicized. However, currently the UN makes 3 different types of projections of population size over the coming decades and up to 2100. And all of those projections show growth up to 2050. But then depending on the level of effort with regard to family planning, stopping child marriage, and girls' education, the lowest projection shows a leveling off and slight decline, while the highest projection continues growth up to 2100, up to maybe 11 billion. So certainly there are economists who are horrified by the idea that population might stop growing. And so there have been major efforts in some countries to stimulate population growth if that country has started to achieve a stable population. This is not well thought through from an ecological standpoint, but nevertheless, some of the articles that have been published claiming that we're going to have a major decline in numbers are based on those concerns and the desire to keep the birth rate up. And so in some countries, for example, Australia, which is running out of water and has among the highest carbon footprints per capita in the world, the government is paying people $5,000 per Australian baby born. So this kind of use of public funds is really questionable, given the fact that ecologists have estimated we are beyond the long-term carrying capacity of the planet with regard to people being able to live at, say, a Western European lifestyle. And also because, as the UN published last year, 100 million species are threatened with extinction. And the top reasons are expanding human numbers, including expanding human habitation and expanding farming, which is destroying wilderness areas where the web of life that makes the planet habitable lives. So certainly sooner or later, we will have to achieve stable or declining population numbers. And to do that, we need to bring about acceptance by people of and understanding by people of the health benefits and economic benefits of smaller family norms and use of family planning.
Yeah, and I would just add to this that, you know, this is why the 2 topics are so intertwined, in that even if there is growing populations in Africa and India, you know, we just have an outsized footprint, environmental footprint with every child born, in the developed world. And we want the ability for all to have running water and electricity and good livelihoods. That, that's the whole idea of the development world. And so I think it needs to be done in tandem and needs to continue to be a discussion within the United States, even as we have a lowering fertility rate, because we are such high consumers. And oftentimes people are like, oh, it's much easier to work on family planning and population than it is consumption, because you can't get, people within the United States to decrease consumption. I think maybe that might be a line from you, Bill or Bob, but it is so hard on both sides.
Kelley, yeah, one thing I want to emphasize is that, while teen pregnancy is on the decline in the United States, our teen pregnancy rate is still one of the highest in the industrialized world. And it's not just teens. 45% of all pregnancies in the United States are unintended. And by reducing unplanned pregnancies, we can help to protect the environment, including endangered species. So thanks for very much bringing that up. Daniel, do we have any other questions from the audience at this time?
Yes, there's another one. This is from Dr. Ruth Richards, and it's directed to Kelley. And it's how much of this information is reaching young kids in the public schools here in the United States?
Yeah, there is one curriculum that I know of run by Population Connection called Population Ed. And it's essentially a demographer's curriculum correlated to the standard course of study. And myself and my coworker are trained to teach that. And my coworker, who is an environmental ed colleague and does the endangered species condoms work, is building additional activities and curriculums to get this word out outside of maybe the formal classroom, where it can be a little bit difficult, in the nature centers and at the Earth Day events and things like that. But I think one of the places where we could have success is maybe not necessarily talking about it in relationship to population, but we have somewhat deplorable sex ed policies within the United States. So only, let me see what my stats are here. Not all states require that it be taught. Only 20 require that you talk about contraception, and only 17 require that it be medically accurate. So when we did our survey, we asked people about the types of things they would be willing to advocate for. And most of them are more aware and knowledgeable and willing to advocate at the federal level. But we're in a polarized country, so there is a lot of work that we can be doing at the state level to increase access. And then specifically at the local level, where your sex ed curriculum is implemented and chosen, you can have a lot of impact there too. So the center's looking at potentially partnering on some local sex ed policy advocacy work in the future.
Thank you, Kelley. That's great. Daniel, you want me to wrap this up?
Sure, yeah, I think we're low on time now and I don't see any new questions, so sure.
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, I encourage your viewers today to take a look at the full presentations that both Bill and Kelley and Stacia as well have done, because I think there's a lot to be learned there. This is obviously a critically important topic. We've talked a little bit about public attitudes, recognizing that population and consumption pose a real challenge to the environment. I think it's incredibly encouraging that we can help to address those issues by using psychology, by appealing to people's better instincts and motives to achieve the kinds of steps that we need to really achieve a sustainable world. So I'm really delighted, Daniel, that you hosted this program today. I want to congratulate Bill and Kelley on their presentations and encourage your audience to continue to look at this critically important issue.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you all put this together and submitted it to us at Division 34. It is, as you said, it is critical. So I really appreciate you being here. Kelley, Bill, and Bob, thank you so much for a great session.
Great. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great, thank you all. So we'll have a short break again and reconvene at 2:30 for our next session on the benefits of nature exposure, which will be an interactive Q&A again with Patricia Winter, Sara Perrins, Carla Bluhm, Morgan Strickland, and Amy Barton. So everybody go grab snacks, a little break, and we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes or so.
Okay, great. So welcome to all who are here, and I'm sure we'll have more people joining us as we get rolling here. This is, the title of this session is called Benefits of Nature Exposure. It's the interactive question and answer with Patricia Winter, Sara Perrins, Carla Bluhm, Amy Barton, and Morgan Strickland. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to our chair of the program, Patricia Winter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. What we planned here is a facilitated dialogue session. And so I've asked each of the panelists to, after I introduce them, answer briefly in 1 or 2 sentences a question. We'll get started with that by first going to, I'm with the Pacific Southwest Research Station of the Forest Service. Sorry, forgot to introduce myself. Thank you, Daniel. And our first person up is Amy Barton from the University of Houston in Houston, Texas. And so Amy, in 1 or 2 sentences, can you tell us what your presentation has to say about the multi-level benefits of nature exposure?
Yeah, so my presentation basically was about how incorporating social emotional learning curriculum with nature exposure can help minoritized youth improve their social skills as well as attitudes towards school.
Thank you. And next up we have Carla Bluhm and Morgan Strickland, both from the College of Coastal Georgia and Brunswick, Georgia. And Carla, could you answer, what does your presentation tell us about the multi-level benefits of nature exposure? And Carla, you're on mute.
Okay, I am unmuted officially. Yes, thank you so much. Our talk was about, it was based on my 230-mile walk over 3 weeks of the Camino de Santiago through Portugal, up into Santiago, Spain. And my kind of meditation of being in the natural world for that amount of time on foot, leading me to kind of bring together 3 thoughts I thought would be really, hopefully interesting to people here at Division 34. This idea of becoming lost and the value of becoming lost and then finding oneself again in the natural world, to the psychological and mental and physical effects of people in built environments, in pilgrim hostels, and I spoke about the effects of snoring on other sleepers and how snorers have a tendency to awaken refreshed and the rest of us did not, and what that meant in terms of the experience of the natural world. And 3, we talked about the ability for, Morgan, do you want to take the 3rd one? Unmute. I think she's still muted.
Morgan, if you can unmute yourself, please. There you go.
Okay. I'm so sorry. So yes, we covered the experience of being lost, and also the experience of staying at albergues on Camino de Santiago, and that interaction of sleeping in an albergue and having to sleep in a room with multiple people where snoring then can hinder your access to much needed resources on the Camino de Santiago.
Exactly.
So if you've been in an environment where there's been snoring going on and you are sleep deprived going into the next day, it definitely hinders that experience.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Morgan, and congratulations to Morgan because she's just graduated from that College of Coastal Georgia. We needed to get that little plug in since she didn't get to have an actual live graduation ceremony. And let's turn now to Sara Perrins from University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. And Sara, if you could please tell us in 1 or 2 sentences, what does your presentation tell about the multi-level benefits of nature exposure?
Sure, thanks for that. So I presented an experiment on the effects of different environments on stress, including a natural environment. And we had a smaller sample due to COVID-19, so the results are preliminary, but we found that the natural environment was compared to the urban environment associated with a smaller spike in heart rate during stressor task and also with faster recovery after the stressor, suggesting that more natural environments may buffer us against some of the negative effects of stress and also promote resilience more than some other environment types.
Thank you. And just to wrap up the intro here, my presentation was a summary of a climate recreation vulnerability assessment for the 10 Sierra Nevada forest management units conducted by the Forest Service with my colleagues Jose Sanchez and Dave Olson. And part of our focus was on the already present climate change impacts in those forest management units, in particular the impacts on what we refer to as niche opportunities, which is a way to look at unique affordances within these forests, as well as iconic experiences, what the impacts are to the benefits of nature, which are extremely important, especially for already vulnerable communities. And lastly, we turn our consideration to talking about those impacts on vulnerable communities from the urban to rural gradient. So as part of our assessment, we were concerned with tourism-dependent communities within or adjacent to forest boundaries, as well as out in the urban realm, folks who might be seeking respite from increasing heat in the urban areas around the Sierra Nevadas, and then what will happen as climate change effects continue to unfold. So with that, we are, by the way, watching the Q&A box, and there is one question here from John Fraser, so I'm going to read that, and then each of the panelists has also been supplied with another specific question if things slow down a little bit. But Johnny asks, I've read a lot of your session descriptions and look forward to hearing your presentations, but I'm going to ask all panelists after the session to consider the relationship of climate anxiety to your findings. And he says, as a preamble in our work on environmentally educated conservation workers, nature experiences are also triggers that can produce negative psychological consequences. So he'd like us to think about how that issue impacts the results of some of our studies or what that might mean for future research. So maybe we can add that in as we go around the panel again and ask your specific questions. If you'd like to loop it back to climate anxiety and workers and advocates in that field, it'd be great. Let's go to Sara first. So Sara, you already touched on this when you gave your summary, but considering the steeper recovery in heart rate after the stressor experience within nature, what implications might there be from your work for nature exposure and resilience during our pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a really relevant question at this time. So researchers right now on an international scale are conducting all sorts of COVID studies. So I'm sure some are investigating this very question. But you know, stress or allostasis, it's an adaptive process, right? It helps us in many or most scenarios. But the problem is with sustained or chronic stress or allostatic overload. And that's where we're failing to give our bodies stress response systems like the HPA axis and the autonomic nervous system the chance to recover. And that's what can perpetuate maladaptation and dysfunction, and give way to all of the bad health outcomes associated with chronic stress, from lost sleep to increased risk for cardiovascular disease and mortality. And so now, with all that the pandemic brings with regard to stress, we're in a bit of trouble, because I think the timeline has long since passed for the pandemic to be an acute stressor. I think we're in the chronic territory now. And so findings like the ones I presented in my study, which again were preliminary, but anything to suggest some benefit for recovery from stress, or better yet, buffering from the effects of stressors to begin with, can be especially relevant at this time. And nature contact is also multi-pronged with regard to health benefits, right? Which are all very welcome at this challenging time. So it's associated with increases also in physical activity and social cohesion, which in themselves are associated with mental health benefits. So yeah, I think it's a refreshing addition to other treatment paradigms.
So any thoughts to respond to Johnny's question of climate-related anxiety for folks who are, say, doing this type of work, or who are advocates for nature, or are in the nature fields?
Yeah, I think one of the easier pitfalls early on in this field is to think that everyone feels about nature the way you might. And there certainly is this, what we consider negative nature, whether historically contextualized, people can be triggered, like Johnny said, by nature. And so, for example, in our experiment, when we did the open-ended debriefing question, we did ask whether people experience the environments positively, negatively. Interestingly, for the neutral condition, people volunteered the word neutral, which was good. And so, it can be kind of adjusted for in your modeling to kind of be a covariate, which we haven't done yet with our study. But yeah, certainly it's the theory that kind of drives this look into whether nature contact can affect our stress reduction kind of is a very meta, it's literally at the species level, right? It's saying as a species, we have this psychoevolutionary response tendency, but really where we need to go in the field is to drill down to individual level differences. How does nature affect us differently? And that's where we're getting at more and more, and I'm doing that as well. And certainly one element of that is with regard to negative triggers.
Thank you. So Carla and Morgan, if you could think about the climate-related anxiety for folks associated with nature-focused research or folks in that field, as well as if you would consider addressing our question that we gave you up front, which was, given the forms of impedance to the nature experience that you described, including snoring and others taking resources such as soup. And if you haven't heard the presentation yet, please go to the on-demand site. It's very intriguing. What thoughts on power differentials and access to nature come to mind from your travels?
I loved the question so much, and I pondered it so many times. I think initially, and Morgan and I shared some thoughts, but initially for me, that was like a metaphor that could work in a couple ways for me. So if I am put at a disadvantage, and maybe it's because I'm a slower walker, or maybe it's because I was in fact robbed of some energy by the soup stealing men, or that I didn't sleep well because the snorers kept me up all night and I lagged behind the pack. I mean, those are actual things that happened. But for me, the metaphor lies in one's ability to access nature and the kind of inherent disadvantages that particular groups could be in, whether it's gender or race or socioeconomic. I mean, who is entitled enough to be able to access nature, especially on the Camino, which is a very long walk? So I think the question kind of unnerved me in a good way. It sort of disrupted my regular chain of thought and made me really consider how a financial disadvantage, et cetera, could put someone ahead. There's so much discussion about feet and foot care and blister care and what socks to wear and what shoes, all sort of mental preparation before one hits such a long distance walk. Some of that is financially needed, However, the more I contemplated your question, Pat, I started to think more about the advantages the people who are disadvantaged. So if one's, and Morgan got me to think about boots. If one's boots are not excellent, maybe to avoid blisters, you walk more slowly. Maybe because I have been robbed of some resources because of just the way I was a walker, I think that kept me more in tune with nature. I had these remarkable revelations that when I was feeling so slow and kind of behind, you know, the people I had been in the albergue the night before were nowhere in sight. I started noticing and identifying with the slowness of slow animals, of an earthworm struggling on the road, or a snail crawling somewhere. And I would almost just say, I know how you feel to be so slow. So I think in some ways, it cemented in my relationship to the natural world. If I'm not the fastest and crushing the Ks, so to speak, on a long distance walk, then I am somebody, and I did numerous times, who could just lie in a field of daisies and take a nap and watch the insects and become part of the natural world. And I'll just say one more quick thing here. I think when I saw animals in the natural world, because I was alone, you know, a lot of the time in 3 weeks, I never felt like I saw a black squirrel or I saw the river, you know, the critter eating a river fish. What I felt like was that we were all in the same place, experiencing that place together. And that, for me, I think is the real answer, that we don't want to think about. We want to encourage everybody to try something like a super long walk. And as far as anxiety about the natural world, and, you know, I was in places in Spain that were so dry. I mean, forests, you know, with eucalyptus leaves everywhere dry, with ferns that were just kilometer after kilometer of crisp, you know, ferns. And I was so fearful that someone was going to smoke and start a forest fire while I was in this situation. So this is one example of a type of anxiety, I think, that I personally encountered on the natural world experience.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Carla. Let's turn to Amy. And Amy, I'm actually going to switch up your question because a relevant one came in here, which was from Dr. Ruth Richards, saying experience in high school, some private schools, for example, in Danville, California, actually require a nature trip for graduation. This seems to be a good fit with what your presentation was about. Many students find it the most important part of their entire experience, both for nature exposure and collaboration and better values as a group. How can such events, maybe just day trips for public school, be built into the curriculum?
Yeah,
and Amy, if I'll add to that, would you always recommend that they would be built in based on what your study findings suggest?
Yeah, great questions. So I guess I should preface, so the thing that was unique about our study was that the addition of the social emotional learning curriculum is really what had the benefits for these students. So the first summer camp that occurred in 2018 had no social emotional learning curriculum, and that's why we saw the actual decrease in well-being. So in other words, they were upset that they were leaving. But in the 2019 summer camps, with the one that had the stronger SEL component, that's where we saw the most benefits. So I think advocating for scientifically informed, evidence-based curriculum, such as social emotional learning curriculum, like overcoming obstacles that are also culturally relevant for our students, is one way that these events can be built into, you know, school counseling programs, things like that, maybe positive behavior intervention supports, things like that. So if you are a school psychologist or a certified school counselor, just advocating for these scientifically informed practices for your administration, just because these programs do have benefits for social, academic, and career development for minoritized students specifically.
And I'm going to tag on a couple of questions. So one I had posed before, where in one of your groups there were actually negative effects from the nature experience. And what implications are there for nature exposure programs that are focused specifically on minority youth? And I think that fits in well with Dr. Richards' question. And then let's just also ask if you see any concerns related to nature becoming a trigger, particularly when there comes an awareness of climate change effects and what may occur. So are we adding to vulnerabilities and stressors by increasing nature awareness for particular groups, perhaps? Just to throw that out there.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. And I think for specifically minoritized youth, you know, they're in schools that are unfortunately underfunded. So we really have to think about how are we able to provide these kind of exposures, because what is most important is that the longer trip that was far away and with the social emotional learning curriculum built in was the one that had the most benefits. But how practically realistic is that for students? So coming up with ways, what we were going to do this summer was how to improve the summer camp that was closer to us to improve benefits, because that one didn't have a strong SEL component. So that kind of answers that question. I guess the climate anxiety part is beyond the scope of our study, for sure, but still a really interesting thing to think about, just because they went to Wyoming, which is many states away from Houston. So we measured anxiety generally on a well-being scale, but not specifically climate anxiety. So I think that'd be a really interesting future direction as more and more students are becoming more global citizens, thinking about the impacts of climate change on nature exposures with the added social emotional learning curriculum.
Thank you. So we have one more question, and then we'll see if some thoughts come up among the panelists if they'd like to add anything here. And we still have some time. And so if folks who are signed on want to pose more questions, please feel free to do so. A question from Aditya Benjamin, I believe. How does the effects of nature exposure compare to other variables, such as connectedness to nature and beliefs about the environment, on its effect on mental health? And for me, when I read that question, I think about the distinction between being in nature and being and considering the type of activity one is engaged in while in nature. So there's some very real differences for types of nature experiences and their role in not only improvements to mental health, where for some folks being in nature is frankly a negative experience where they've already had a risk-related or negative experience in the past, and this is not positive for them, or perhaps they're engaged in an activity that doesn't foster the same forms of nature observation or building connections with nature. So I think those pieces of the experience of being outdoors are nuances that we all need to consider, as well as the aspects related to environmental quality, safety in the area. So we tend to give blanket recommendations of getting people outdoors, but we need to recognize there are these complexities in terms of prior experience, how nature is viewed by the individual, both within their own space, personal experiences, as well as perhaps culturally related experiences or familiar experiences, aspects of belonging. It is quite complex. And so we make these favorable statements towards the benefits of nature exposure, all the while recognizing that there are these pieces that would add qualifiers that, given the space of, say, our 7-minute presentation challenges, and was frankly beyond what most of us could cover, but I think is a real consideration. So I see a lot of folks nodding. Sara, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, Great response, Pat. I agree with so much of what you said, and it's very multifaceted. But as a construct, connectedness to nature, or another one is like nature relatedness, is seen as a trait. People have sort of their own individual stance towards nature, spiritual connection, as well as attitudes, pro-environmentalism, and such. And I think as we kind of look at nature exposure and nature as a resource for salutary benefits in like the public health sense, so we really want to kind of get at how can we apply this, to the community and to populations, and trying to narrow down the natural environment as being the active ingredient, as the environmental health determinant. I think it's important to measure these kind of what can be considered confounders. So if you're not measuring how someone feels about nature and then putting them in nature and just saying, are they feeling good or not, you might just be getting someone who just loves nature, being put out into nature, doing well in nature. But again, going back to negative nature and whatnot, I think it's important to measure kind of those individual level differences. And actually in our study, we did do that. We did control for their nature relatedness scores and whatnot. And so we're getting a little closer to a more generalizable view of the natural environment as the environmental health determinant.
There we go. Sorry. Carla, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just very briefly, such an interesting array of ideas are emerging as I'm listening. But, part of what I wanted to convey also was that for some aspects of something like the Camino, so the Camino is about 1,000-year-old path, and it's many, many paths through Italy or through Paris. I mean, there's many branches into Santiago in Spain. Having said that, there are these little roly-poly seeds that fall off of the eucalyptus trees. And I know the eucalyptus trees haven't always been, they're not native to the area, but have been there a long time. So when I'm walking and I'm feeling the little roly-polies, I'm thinking of the, thousands, 320,000 people finish a Camino a year, not, again, split through paths, but they had the same foot experience during that day. If the path is muddy, there's mud on our pants. If it dries, there's dust on our pants. So in some ways, although the climate is changing, at the end of the day, literally at the end of the day, and because you're carrying your pack for so long, we have to meet at a trough and hand wash, usually our clothes, where we come together socially because of the actual climate effects on us for that day, whether it was dust or mud. So for me, in my experience, the earth is providing this sort of glue and binder of the actual state we arrive in until the albergue, where conversations happen. We try to talk in multiple languages. And I loved the Camino for that. And I think that, and I don't know if it matters per se if climate changes, which is interesting.
Thank you. And I'm mindful of our time, but I do want to just give Amy a chance. Amy, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'm making a note that I think this would be a really interesting variable to consider in our next iteration of the summer camps, just because, so it's like middle school, 8th grade-ish. So I'm wondering how is the development of, in individuals, nature relatedness, nature connectedness going to develop as, a result of these summer camp experiences. So I've learned a lot from this division and from all of your presentations. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to turn folks' attention to the Zoom chat, where a resource, a link to Susan Clayton's recent work in The Lancet is available to this audience. In case you're interested in learning more about climate anxiety and eco-anxiety, Susan has done quite a bit of work in this area, as have other division members, just to be cognizant of that larger space of body of work that's been developing over time. For me, when I think about climate anxiety, I think about the empowerment that comes from going a step beyond awareness to thinking about how we can lead from where we are and what we can do. And in fact, having those conversations is an important next step. Not that some of these aspects are as simple as the quick short list that emerged early on, 50 things you can do to save the climate or whatever it was, but more detailed. For example, in this vulnerability assessment, an important aspect of sitting down with managers, recreation service providers, and community leaders was to talk through, all right, now that we're aware of these effects that are already present and those that will continue to emerge, what can we do separately and together to develop very specific adaptation strategies and tactics? So what are we going to do moving ahead to preserve the important aspects of recreation? And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate that all of you submitted your work to Division 34 so that we could host it. It's been a privilege. There was one question, I think a couple of you have already responded in the chat, about email addresses that, if you're comfortable sharing that in the chat, go ahead and do so, because I think you've stimulated our audience and they might want to correspond with you that way. And I just want to make a quick note. I know we're kind of out of time, but we have a few more things going on today, live events. Coming up, we have at 3:30 the Behavioral Solutions Workshop hosted by Dr. Reuven Sussman. That should be a really great session, highly interactive, where you'll have a chance to solve or work towards solving a real world problem. And then there are a couple of social events later on. Thanks, Ezra. Ezra just shared the schedule for today. So you can see there at 7, we have Division 34 Climate Change and Mental Health Working Group social hour, and then the student happy hour, which follows at 9 Eastern. So join any, join all are welcome. Thank you so much.
And I'll also just add that our program will then continue tomorrow at 1 o'clock. We'll be back with another interactive Q&A with Nicole Sentov, Alexia Lamb, and Kristen Hurst on increasing pro-environmental behavior. And then we have a slightly longer session from 1:45 to 3 p.m. tomorrow, which we're calling a presidential forum in Town Hall, which will be with 9 or 10 past, present, and incoming Division 34 presidents, kind of a discussion of where the division's been and where we think it might be headed. And of course, we'll have opportunities for folks in the audience to ask questions and contribute. So I hope folks can also make it to tomorrow's sessions. And then Daniel, do you want to just briefly mention and put in a plug for Saturday's new event, because it's many people may not have.
We have a late addition to our schedule. So Saturday at 1 Eastern, running from 1 to 2 Eastern, we'll have a session, a conversation with Dr. Philip Zimbardo and Shari Young-Kuchenbecker, who will be talking about how to engage with and how to further stimulate the youth environmental movement that we've all been seeing. So don't miss that.
Great. Thanks so much. And thank you everybody for attending. And I hope we see many of you at other events later tonight and tomorrow.